Hey Vimeo, back with another tutorial. It's been a little while. This one is about processing and using scan data for things like game and film and environment assets. What I'm going to show you today is just a very quick technique using Zbrush to make something usable out of your scans. Scan data is becoming increasingly popular. I use it on a day-to-day basis, everything from photogrammetry to LiDAR. But at the end of the day, you have to make something usable out of it and how to use it. So this is just one technique. There's several using Zbrush or Maya and the Quad Draw tool and the Substance Batch tools, which is a personal favorite, Topogun, which is great. And if there's interest in more videos, I'd be happy to make a video for each, and we can actually go through different processes and how to process scan data. So this one is kind of a smash and grab technique. It's very quick using Zbrush and basically copying the data over to a lower poly asset. So if we look at the scan, this was captured with a single camera. This was a Canon Rebel T1i, I think. I did this a few years ago. The original scan was 4 million triangles when it was processed, and within minutes, I'd say maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, we can get it down to something a little more respectable and get it into something renderable with maps. So if we took a look at the wireframe, the wireframe isn't great. For example, there aren't loops for the eyes, loops around the mouth, and the flow isn't exactly efficient for things like animation, so this may not be the best method for animation techniques, but for quick scan to game asset or previs or something like that, this method is very quick. So I'll kind of run through the process in Zbrush from raw scan to get to this point. So if we open up Zbrush, this is the raw scan that came out of Agisoft. So you can see here it's 4 million triangles, and it's a little soft. There are some areas that need a tiny bit of fixing. There's some straggling bits here. And first and foremost, if you're an Agisoft user, you might notice that my statue is upright on the grid, fairly straight. In Agisoft, you actually have the ability to rotate and move the scan around in the up y-axis. If you're an Agisoft user, you may note if you import it into Maya or something else, it'll come in upside down and backwards. You can write that fairly close. You can see it's a little tilted here, but it's not bad. And it's probably forward in the Z and not necessarily at 0, 0, 0 in the world axis. But that's fine. The important thing is that I'm not going to move, scale, or rotate. We don't want to do that because I'll explain later as we get into the texturing process. We have the ability to export this back into Agisoft as long as it hasn't moved in its world coordinates. It'll import right back into Agisoft, and you can use those camera projections again to project high-end textures. So we have our raw scan data, and first thing I like to do is import it and take a look at any straggling bits like we see here, these little floaters. Depending on your scan, you may have quite a few, or maybe not very many at all if you do a lot of masking. So I'm going to open up the tool palette here on the right, and under Polygroups, I'm just going to click Autogroups. Let that chug for a second, and you can see anything that's not connected to the main mesh is going to be assigned a different polygroup, a different color. And then I could just Control and Shift and click on the main scan, and all those little bits are going to hide and disappear. And then I could just click Delete Hidden. Now all those little straggling bits are gone. That's at this point we can start thinking about cleaning up the mesh. Some of these areas, like in here, we can smooth it down and soften. However, I wouldn't do too much. Actually, first things first, what I'm going to do is under the tool palette, we're at 4 million. Under subtool, I'm going to go ahead and click, I'm going to go ahead and do Control D and just divide one more time. So now we are at 11 million, which is a nice high number. And the reason I do that is we want to get a little more detail out of this scan. It's pretty nice, but it's a little soft in the necklace areas and detail areas, and we want to try and get as much detail as possible. So the cool part about photo scanning is not only do you get sort of the base mesh here, but you also get a texture map that's associated with it. It creates these auto UVs along with photo quality textures. Now the UV obviously looks terrible. There's nothing we can really do with this. But we can actually use it to our advantage to try and squeeze just an extra drop of detail out of what we already have. So if we open up the alpha palette at the very, very top, and I'm going to click the little swatch icon here on the left to dock it. I'm going to go to import, and I'm actually going to import that color map. Now it's going to come in as a black and white desaturated image, totally fine. We're going to go down and make sure that we flip vertical and scroll down to texture map. Now we have to make sure that there's a new texture loaded, otherwise this won't work. So we're just going to click new texture, and it should be a white swatch. Now right below that is displacement map. We're going to open that up, click the swatch, and load our alpha that we already had loaded. So now we have an alpha loaded, and we actually have the alpha loaded into the displacement slot. It should say disp on, and then we have an intensity slider here below it. We want to enter a very, very low value. Change my matte cap. We want to enter a pretty low value. I would say 0.007, 0.008, maybe to 0.01. So very, very low values. We're going to do 0.008 and take a look at the model. And we'll hit enter. Let me zoom in here because you should actually see a pretty big difference. Now nothing's been applied yet, so we can actually just toggle this on and off. So here's the soft mesh, and then here's the displacement on. And this is just using the UV map that was given to us. So we actually get a nice little boost in our detail here. Off, on, off, on. So if we like what we see, and of course the higher the subdivision, the better the result's going to be. We're going to say apply displacement map. Alright, so that's done. We can actually turn all this stuff off. And we actually have an 11 million polygon mesh with this detail physically pressed into the clay itself. So this is sort of the final raw mesh that we want to extrapolate the new mesh from. So it's a good idea to, before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and apply the texture. So at the very top, I'm going to open up texture, dock it to the right using the swatch there, import. We're going to import the very same texture that we did in the alpha palette. Remember to flip vertically using the flip V button. And under texture, where we had the white swatch, we can click it again and add our actual texture. I'm going to change the matte cap here to something neutral, like white. So this was the actual stone texture that we captured with our camera. Now the thing is, this is a texture map, it's an image. We need to be able to transfer that to the new mesh. This is sort of that smash and grab technique, and why it's very quick and easy to do inside of Zbrush. Instead of doing any sort of projections or anything like that, we can actually convert this into polypaint and use that to our advantage. So if we scroll up just 2 tabs in the tool palette to polypaint, I'm going to make sure colorize is on. I'm going to hit spacebar and make sure mRGB is on, and click polypaint from texture. Now what that did is it just turned our texture map is no longer on, so the image isn't actually being used. This is actually in the clay itself. Now the only problem with this process is it's dependent on how high your resolution is, and it will actually slightly distort your texture map. Depending, there might be some slight loss. So this is just one technique. I'll talk about another technique towards the end of this, or we don't have to use the color map from here. We can use that back in Agisoft. But this is the absolute fastest way to get a scan in and get it out. If you're using the newest version of Zbrush, it's 64-bit, so you can divide pretty high, and the loss that you get is so minimal. If this is a background asset, a game asset, you probably wouldn't even notice a difference. So now we have this embedded into the clay itself. I'm going to go up to Subtool and make a duplicate. And the reason for making a duplicate is this duplicate is where we can actually make a lot of changes and still have the original to project back to if needed. So at this point we can go in and can kill that poly paint if needed. And we can do things like smooth out these edges, which are a little rough, if needed. We can run the excuse me, my computer's lagging here. Drop that subdivision level. We can run the close holes if we needed to. I would really recommend doing this on the duplicate because it will destroy the UV and we need something to project back on. So always a good idea to do that on the duplicate. I'm going to keep it just kind of as is. This could be re-sculpted and fixed up, but we just want to get this in and get this out. Okay. So if we're happy with where we're at and we have the original to project back to, remember that's very important, we're going to go ahead and go under Geometry and Zremesher, and we're going to give this a quick Z-remesh. Now the reason, once again, we made a duplicate is Z-remesher will overwrite the data that's here, the triangles that are here, and change the mesh. And we need an original with all of its high-end detail to project all that detail back onto. So once again, always important, make a duplicate, Zremesh. There's whole tutorials on how to use Zremesher to the utmost advantage. Joseph Drust on Zbrush Central has a whole tutorial, or several tutorials, on using things like Zremesher guides, which if you go in your brush and Zremesher guides, it's splines that you can lay out the flow, all kinds of stuff like that. I'm going to keep it basically default. Under Zremesher, I will leave adaptive on. I'm going to put in an account of, let's say, 13,000 or 12,000. And we'll just see what that looks like. I'm going to go ahead and keep it default because if it needs to change a little bit, that's fine. I know this is a statue in the background of, let's say, a game or a film or something. It's not going to move or animate. If you need animation geometry, once again, this method may not be the best. But I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and let this chug, and we'll see where we end up. Okay, so that's all completed. Here is the polygonal mesh that we end up with. It's because I left adaptive on, it may be a little bit higher. It's still fairly high, 20,000. But that's fine. If we take a look at the mesh, the one thing I did go ahead and do was I UV mapped it and gave it some polygroups, and talk about that real quick. So if I hit Shift F, we can see the quick and dirty little polygroups that I gave it, and the reason I did that was that each polygroup will create a UV island in UV Master. So just try to break up the scan very quickly as to what would make a decent UV shell. And if we go up to Z plugin at the very top, dock it to the right, and under UV Master we can open that up. Now there's whole tutorials on how to do that too, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I will say at this point it's highly recommended that you do a save or a quick save by hitting 9 on the keyboard. The reason being is if you do a Zremesher, especially on things like scan data, and the geometry is a little wonky in some areas, and if you have like a hole anywhere, it's going to get very, very crash happy very quickly. So definitely hit 9 at this point. So once again, broke it up into some quick poly groups. Normally by default symmetry is on. I'm going to turn that off because a scan is not symmetrical, obviously. I'm going to turn polygroups on, and the last thing I'm going to mention is in the workflows for UV Master, they talk about working on a clone, clicking that and painting areas to stay away from or to attract seams. I would really stay away from that if you're using scan data. And the only reason being is as soon as you work on a clone, the clone itself is going to be at least in my experience, at 0, 0. It's going to be at a different coordinate space than your original scan. And when you do a clone, you get it the way you want, and you click copy UVs and you paste the UVs. Not only do you paste the UVs, you paste the coordinates. And I've personally noticed when I tried to do that, my resulting scan ended up being away from the original. If you're just going to use Zbrush and do this workflow, that's totally fine. But if you do want to take this back into Agisoft and do a reproject, that will completely screw it up. So it's up to you. It's not a huge deal, but I don't do the work on clone thing when doing the scan data. So I just polygroups and unwrap. It's not fantastic, but it's quick. And then, so now that we have something UV'd and remeshed, now we want to get that detail back onto this version. So if we undo solo, we can see that it sits directly on top of this guy here. This was our original with our texture map. Turned into polypaint. Turn solo back on. And all I'm going to do is go down to Subtool, Project, and Project All. Because this mesh is made from the original, it sits so close, I really wouldn't worry about all these sliders here. And I typically do projections per layer, so I'll go ahead and do a Project All. And this may take a moment. And you can see what it's doing. Not only is it aligning the polygons, but it's actually projecting over that polypaint data. So now if I do a Control D and Project All, it's going to get finer or more refined, and then I'm going to do Control D again, Project All, and it's just going to get more and more refined. You may notice, especially if you're doing human subjects or animation data, you will get artifacts around things like the eyes, lips, and mouth. The easiest way to solve that is between projections. You can store a morph target and use the morph brush to morph that back into position, and it's very non-destructive. Any questions about the morph brush? I actually have a tutorial on this Vimeo page about using morph targets, and feel free to hit me up about that if you have any questions. So I'm just going to divide this a few times, and you'll notice when I project all that it's going to get pretty close to the original. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this once again, just because it may take a couple of minutes. This is when you get up in the couple millions, you hit project and walk away and grab a cup of coffee. So I'll be back in just a moment. Alright, so that's finally done projecting. It took a few minutes dealing with millions and millions of polygons, but it's done. So we can see the detail transferred over along with the poly paint all in one shot. Here's our low poly or lower poly version with the polygroups. And our original high poly. And honestly, I really can't tell the difference. So we have it UV'd, we have it lower poly, and everything transferred over. Now we can make some maps. So I'm going to go up to Z plugin at the very, very top, dock it over, and under multi-map exporter, I'm just going to turn a few of these options on, including export mesh, cavity, ambient occlusion, texture from polypaint, and normal. So this texture from polypaint is why it was so important that we do that transfer in the beginning. Now we can extract a texture map out from the polypaint that we converted. So we convert and then get a map out the other side. Go ahead and select the size that you want. I'm going to stick with 4K. Change whatever options you want. Once again, there's whole tutorials on how to use the multi-map exporter. Comes in handy, works pretty well. And then we're going to create all maps. I've already done this step, so we're going to kind of skip it. And then we'll jump into Marmoset, which is what I'm choosing to render in. So if I go ahead and do a new scene, and file, import. So here's our mesh that's actually imported. I will say there is one other step that I did, just to mention briefly. If you import this in directly from Zbrush, Zbrush facets all the faces and polygons and makes the edges hard. Don't know why, but we don't necessarily want that. So you can dump it into Maya or Cinema 4D or Blender or whatever you're using. Throw it in real quick. I like to do like a center pivot, and just at this point, since we're done, we can put it at 0, 0 in the world coordinates, and then I do a soften edge. And that's where you get this nice softness to it, and it's going to make the normal map show up that much better. So we could just start plugging stuff in. So we have our material applied, and I'm going to turn on gloss, specular. I'm going to change this sky to something different. And if you guys haven't used Marmoset yet, it's cheap and fantastic as a rendering engine. I absolutely love it. So load in our texture map. Or you know what, I'm going to load in the normal first. And our texture map. So you can see a little spot here that has to do with, this is one that I created very quickly before the tutorial, and that little spot ended up outside the UV space. That's fine. This is just for tutorial purposes. So we'll load in our ambient occlusion. Kind of dial that back a little bit. And our cavity. And blur that out a little bit. Change our focal length. And this is all just pretty standard stuff inside Marmoset. Very easy to use. Absolutely love it as a rendering engine. And that's pretty much it. So just plugging in a few maps that we got from Zbrush. This whole process, once you get pretty quick at it and do it a few times, should take maybe 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. Once again, the method is not to have an animation ready asset per se, like a character or a figure, but it's a good way to either previs something really quick or take scan data and just knock down an environment asset into something that's much more manageable to use. Other videos are sure to come where I could talk about Topogun and other animation ready assets, but this is very, very quick. I do this very often for a lot of statues or game assets or things in the background. Any questions, feel free to message me on Vimeo. Thanks.